Okay, welcome everyone to Module 3 of Chapter 3. So this one is going to be focusing primarily on the nervous system and the different divisions and structures within the nervous system. This, as I've mentioned, is probably the longest module that we're going to have in this chapter. There's a lot more slides. Luckily, a lot of them are just kind of diagrams, just illustrating parts of the brains and talking about them, parts of the brain. So hopefully, even though it's a lot of content, it doesn't take as long to get through. So mainly what you want to be focusing on is kind of understanding the different divisions of the nervous system and probably understanding like at least a function or two of the major brain components that we're going to talk about. So I might actually pause this one halfway through the lecture and continue on with it tomorrow. I have just recorded the last 2 modules in a row. So if I do kind of run out of steam, I'm starting to lose my voice a bit, I think, because it's been a lot of talking in the past couple months between this and my own classes that I'm in. So if I do pause, I will pick it up later, but I wanted to get started and start to kind of review the nervous system and its different components. So this one, even though, like I said, it's a lot of content, I think it's a fairly fun lecture, just because it's going to teach you a lot about what makes us who we are and what the different areas of our brain and nervous system kind of do for us, how they all come together. And at the end, we get to talk about something very special called split brain, which I personally find fascinating. It is a little tricky to kind of understand, but hopefully I'll be able to show you with examples a bit about what I'm talking about. So let's get started. So Module 3.3, Structure and Organization of the Nervous System. So the nervous system is essentially the system that acts to gather and process information, produce responses, and coordinate different cell functioning. So some organisms may have a very simple nervous system consisting of only 1 or 2 cells. But in human beings, the nervous system consists of billions of cells. So we talked about those neurons and glial cells last class. Those are just, we did a kind of an overview of what they are and what they do, but there are billions of them within our nervous system. So our nervous system is divided into 2 main parts. We have our central nervous system, which kind of goes directly down the center of our body, as you'll see in a second, and our peripheral nervous system, which, as the name implies, is kind of on the outer edges. So it's kind of what spreads out from that central nervous system and connects to the rest of our body. So each of these components have their own different kind of areas as well as functions, which we will discuss in detail. So the central nervous system, or CNS, receives, processes, interprets, and stores sensory information. So essentially it consists of 2 components, the brain and the spinal cord. So even though it's just those 2 components, obviously we know that the brain is responsible for pretty much everything we do. So it's a very, very important system within our body. So it basically sends out signals to our muscles, glands, and internal organs to kind of tell them how to respond to stimuli, as well as being the component that actually helps us process the stimuli and make sense of our world around us. So the spinal cord is an extension of the brain, which runs from the base of the brain down the center of the back, and it's protected by a column of bones, which is known as the spinal column, and it functions as a bridge to connect the brain to the rest of the body below the neck. So basically, your brain is obviously in your head. Your spinal cord is kind of what runs down, most of the length of your body, and it helps kind of connect that brain and the spinal cord, that central nervous system, to the peripheral nervous system. So all the other nerves that kind of run down to your fingertips and your toes and kind of takes the information from your senses and transmits them up to the brain, and then takes the response from your brain and transmits it back down to all your extremities. The peripheral nervous system handles the input and output of the central nervous system. So it contains all portions of the nervous system outside of the brain and spinal cord, and without it, the central nervous system could not collect information about the outside world. So some people might kind of imply that the central nervous system is more important because it contains our brain, but really we wouldn't be able to receive any sensory information or send signals out to our body to kind of tell us how to react and what to do if it wasn't for our peripheral nervous system. So it transmits the signals between the brain and the rest of the body, and it itself is also divided into 2 subcomponents. So we have our sensory nerves, and these aren't the subcomponents, but these are the types of nerves within the peripheral nervous system. We have our sensory nerves, which carry messages from skin, muscle, and other sense organ receptors up to the spinal cord, which then carries them to the brain for processing. So it basically puts us in touch with both the outside world as well as our own bodily activities. So it carries the information from glands and things up to the brain as well. And then we have our motor nerves, which kind of act in the opposite direction. So they carry orders from the central nervous system back to the muscles, glands, and internal organs, which enable us to move and to secrete substances from our glands, such as hormones, which we talked about a lot in the last lecture. So within the peripheral nervous system, as I mentioned, there are two separate subsystems. We have the somatic or bodily nervous system, which is also known as the skeletal nervous system. And that one consists of nerves that receive sensory input from the body, as well as control the skeletal muscles, which are responsible for voluntary and reflexive movement. And then we have the autonomic or self-governing nervous system, which is the portion of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, responsible for controlling the functioning of glands, blood vessels, and internal organs. So things like your bladder, your stomach, and your heart. So the things that we don't really have control over. For example, you don't tell your heart to beat. You don't tell your lungs to breathe. But those would all be under the control of that autonomic nervous system. So those automatic things that occur within our body. That's how you can kind of remember it. Autonomic, automatic. So it's known as the self-governing nervous system because, again, it's automatic. It doesn't really need to be told what to do, whereas the somatic or bodily nervous system is responsible for all of our voluntary movement. So it's what we're actually using to, tell our legs to move or tell our arms to move and things like that, like the actual physical movements that we are in control of. So the autonomic nervous system is further broken down into two parts which work together, but in opposing ways, to constantly adjust the body to environmental changes. So we have what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which acts as an accelerator. It mobilizes the body, prepares it for action or the output of energy. It makes you blush, sweat, breathe more deeply, increases your heart rate and your blood pressure, and is responsible for what is known as the fight or flight response. So when you are in a threatening situation, we usually either choose to kind of confront the threat, so the fight, or we choose to run away from the threat, so the flight response. And so basically what happens is when you're put in that kind of situation, your autonomic nervous system within your peripheral nervous system basically kind of causes your body to start to ramp everything up and kind of prepare for that immediate action in order to face the threat. And so then the parasympathetic kind of acts opposite to that. So it acts as a brake, it slows things back down, and enables the body to conserve and store energy. So basically to maintain what we call a homeostatic balance. So it maintains that sense of equilibrium within your body. So the sympathetic nervous system amps you up, gets you ready for action. So especially if you're being faced with a threat, something stressful, and you need to deal with it, that sympathetic nervous system prepares you for action. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system kind of brings you back down to your normal baseline. And so you can see this figure on the side here. There's a few things that are associated with the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system. And you should be able to kind of at least list 2 or 3 different kind of features that are associated with each. So for example, sympathetic nervous system causes your pupils to dilate. So you'd be able to kind of take in more sensory information and kind of see what might be threatening to you, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system would cause pupils to contract. In the sympathetic nervous system, your heart rate and your breathing rate increase because, again, trying to take in more oxygen, prepare you kind of for action, versus in the parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to slow down your heart rate and slow down your breathing. And then the sympathetic nervous system actually slows your digestion because really, if you're in a threatening situation, your body doesn't really need to be devoting its resources at that point to digestion. But then your parasympathetic nervous system would help kind of speed back up that digestion after the threat is passed. So here's our nervous system overview. So you should be able to kind of talk a bit about the different divisions within the nervous system, the central versus peripheral. Within the central, you have the brain and the spinal cord, and we're about to get way more in depth into the brain and the different areas within it. Within the peripheral, you have your autonomic and your somatic nervous system. So basically your automatic versus kind of your voluntary nervous system. And then within your autonomic, you have your sympathetic and your parasympathetic division. So you should be familiar with all of those and kind of the definitions of each and a bit about what each entails. So now it's time for us to take our tour through the brain. So it's widely accepted that different parts of the brain perform different functions. So they overlap at times, but we do have what I mentioned, I think honestly, maybe in the first chapter, if not the second, which is known as localization of function. And it dates back to kind of attempts to determine what different brain areas do, which began with that kind of theory of phrenology, so the bumps on your head, meaning things about the brain areas underneath them. So there are many different major structures which comprise the brain. This section is going to take us through each of them and highlight their important functions, although it is important to keep in mind that any activity involves many different structures all working together. So these descriptions are obviously going to be a bit of a simplification. But for your purposes, like I mentioned, you just kind of need to know generally where the brain areas are and kind of what functions they're involved in. So here's a little overview of the structures. You can pause here if you'd like and kind of take a look at them. You can come back to this slide after we talk about them in a bit more detail, but these are basically a few of the structures that we're going to go through within this section. And here are a couple diagrams of the brain. So this one is from the older textbook we used to use, but I like how it kind of shows that cross section. You can see a bunch of the important brain areas we're going to talk about. And then we also have this other diagram from our newer textbook that shows both the hindbrain and the midbrain. So when we're talking about the brain, we typically divide it into three sections. The hindbrain is essentially kind of your brainstem. It contains your pons, your medulla, your reticular activating system, or what we'll call the reticular formation, as well as your cerebellum, which is kind of like your lesser brain. Then you have your midbrain, which is kind of, as the name implies, located within the middle of your brain, so containing things like your thalamus and your hypothalamus and things like that. And then we also have what's known as the forebrain, which isn't really labeled here, but it's basically the really large portion that typically when most people think of the brain, they tend to think of the really large kind of convoluted brain structure. So we'll begin with the hindbrain. So the brain stem begins at the base of the skull. It's described as being like a stalk rising out of the spinal cord, and it is comprised of two main structures. One is the medulla, and the other one is known as the pons. So the pons is mostly involved in sleeping, waking, and dreaming, whereas the medulla is responsible for unconscious bodily functions such as our breathing and our heart rate. So if somebody, for example, died by hanging, a lot of the time what happens is actually when they had that really kind of jerk motion of the rope against their neck, what happens is that it basically severs their medulla or it damages their medulla, and that kind of immediately stops their breathing and heart rate function. So that's why damage to kind of your brainstem, that area of your neck, can be very detrimental. Within the core of the brainstem, we have something known as the reticular formation, which is a dense network of neurons which extend above the brainstem into the center of the brain, so it kind of connects it up to the midbrain and to the forebrain, and it's involved in attention and alertness. So the reticular formation screens incoming sensory information and basically arouses higher centers when attention is warranted. So without it, we wouldn't really be able to be alert or even conscious. The cerebellum, which was kind of that big kind of lumpy feature I pointed out at the base of the brain, it's also kind of known as the lesser brain at times. It's a lobe-like structure at the base of the brain that's involved in monitoring of movement, maintaining balance, attention, and emotional responses. So it does help coordinate muscles and contribute to our sense of balance so that we're able to move smoothly and precisely. So in that way, it is kind of basic and kind of, as the name implies, the lesser brain. And we do see that a damaged cerebellum would likely result in clumsiness and incoordination, but it is also involved in remembering certain simple skills and reflexes, as well as playing a role in complex cognitive tasks as well. So it may not be as lesser as the name implies. Next, we have the midbrain. I'm not going to spend much time in this section. So the midbrain is basically just above the hindbrain and kind of within the middle of the forebrain almost in a way. And it primarily functions as a relay station between the sensory and motor areas of the brain. So it kind of sends signals back and forth to different brain areas. So the midbrain is involved with the reflexive ability to identify the location of sudden movements and sounds. So something called the superior colliculus influences the ability to capture your visual attention, whereas the inferior colliculus influences the ability to move your auditory attention. And that's pretty much as you need to know for those two. And then finally, we have our forebrain. So the forebrain is the most visually obvious center of the brain, consisting of multiple interconnected structures that are critical to complex thinking, such as emotion, memory, thinking, and reasoning. Complex processing. So one major structure within the forebrain is what's known as the basal ganglia, which is an area involved in facilitating planning movements and skill learning, facilitating planned movements and skill learning, as well as integrating sensory movement information with the brain's reward system. So again, it kind of connects other areas together in a way. And sorry, I mentioned the thalamus as part of the midbrain for some reason, but it is actually considered a part of the forebrain. So it is deep in the brain's interior, so it's roughly right in the center of the brain, and it acts as the sensory relay station of the brain. So it directs incoming sensory messages from your sensory organs, so your eyes, your ears, your touch centers, as well as your taste buds. And it basically directs those incoming sensory messages to the higher areas, which are in charge of vision, sound, and touch. And the reason why I paused there and thinking about it is because I wanted to make sure I didn't say smell, because sense of smell completely bypasses the thalamus. So it's the only one of our 5 kind of typical senses we talk about that has its own private switching station, known as the olfactory bulb. So all of the other 4 senses, they all kind of go through the thalamus, and then those signals are sent elsewhere in the brain for processing. But sense of smell actually completely bypasses the thalamus and goes directly to its own particular processing section within the brain. And it lies near areas involved in emotion, which may be why certain smells invoke vivid memories, so kind of more emotional memories we might have. The forebrain includes 2 areas previously discussed in our section on hormones. It has the hypothalamus, which sits below the thalamus, as the name would imply, hypo meaning below, and the pituitary gland, which is a cherry-sized gland which hangs down from the thalamus. And so that one, as we talked about, is kind of like that master gland within the endocrine system. The forebrain also houses the limbic system, which is an integrated network involved in emotion and memory. It consists of an almond-shaped gland known as the amygdala, which facilitates memory formation for emotional events and mediates fear responses, and appears to play a role in recognizing and interpreting emotional stimuli as well. So the amygdala is heavily implicated in emotion, especially fear and aggression. And it also contains the hippocampus, which is an area critical for learning and memory, particularly in the formation of new memories. So you might remember me talking about the hippocampus a little bit back in the last chapter on memory. So here's kind of a little visual depiction of that limbic system. So you can see we have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. Then we also have something called the corpus callosum here, which we'll talk about in a bit, that connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain. So finally, our last kind of section of the brain to talk about will be the cerebral cortex. So it is still a part of the forebrain. As I mentioned before, it's that part that you kind of tend to think of when you think of what the brain looks like. It's the convoluted, wrinkled outer layer of the brain that is involved in multiple higher functions. For example, things like your thought, your language, and your personality. So this cortex is made up of gray matter as opposed to the white matter that's found elsewhere. And it's divided into 2 halves, which we call cerebral hemispheres, and they are connected by a large bands of fibers, which I kind of pointed out in that diagram, which is known as the corpus callosum. So it's a densely concentrated bundle of nerve cells that kind of send signals back and forth from one half of the brain to the other. So the right hemisphere is actually in charge of the left side of the body and vice versa. So it's something that we call contralateralization. So if you move your left hand, that's actually being controlled by the right hemisphere of your brain. And each hemisphere does have its own particular tasks and talents. So there's something called hemispheric specialization. So they do, although both hemispheres of the brain are involved in most things, usually different tasks and different behaviors are more associated with one hemisphere than the other. So that cerebral cortex is actually only about 3 millimeters thick, so very, very thin, but it contains almost 3/4 of all of the cells within our brain. So very, very densely packed neurons within that area of the brain. Which makes sense because, as we mentioned, it's the one that's responsible for the most complex functioning. So here's another kind of visual of that corpus callosum, which connects those two cerebral hemispheres. And now we're going to talk a bit about the lobes in each cortex. So within each cerebral hemisphere, there are deep fissures inside the cortex. You can kind of see them illustrated by kind of the black lines in this diagram here. It's really apparent between the green, the red, and the yellow there. And so it divides the cortexes into 4 distinct regions or lobes, each which have their own specialties and their own associated cortexes. So we have our occipital lobes, our parietal lobes, our temporal lobes, and our frontal lobes. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about each of those as well as the cortexes that they contain. So the frontal lobes are, as implied, at the front of the brain. They contain the motor cortex, which issues orders to our muscles, kind of tells them how to move, as well as an area known as Broca's area, which is in the left side, so it's in the left hemisphere of the frontal lobe, because, as I kind of implied, we have basically 1/2 of each lobe in each hemisphere. And so Broca's area is responsible for speech production, and it is important to numerous higher cognitive functions such as planning, inhibition of impulses and emotion, language production, as well as voluntary movement, which kind of makes sense because, as I mentioned, the motor cortex is located within the frontal lobes. Then we have the parietal lobes, which are kind of located at the top of the brain behind the frontal lobes. So they contain a cortex known as the somatosensory cortex, which receives information about touch, pain, pressure, and temperature. So parts of these lobes are also involved in attention and awareness of spatial relations as well. So they have a lot to do with our sense of touch as well as our sense of bodily awareness, so where our body is within space. And something that I kind of use to keep straight which cortex is associated with which lobe is I like to think of pressure, pain, touch, and temperature, start with P, P, T, T, and so that makes me think parietal. And that's where the somatosensory cortex is, which is responsible for that type of information. Then we have our occipital lobes, which are located at the lower back part of the brain. They are where visual information is processed, and they contain the visual cortex. So the processing of visual signals occurs within that visual cortex, and we see that damage to that area can cause impaired recognition skills as well as blindness, because of course if you damage the area responsible for visual processing, that may lead you to have deficits in your vision. And I remember this one because I think of occipital starting with an O, and I also think the words optometry, optician, they start with O as well, and they're related to vision, so that's kind of how I conceptualize that in my mind. It's kind of a silly thing, but if it helps you remember, then I like to tell students just in case. And I also think of the fact that, and we'll talk about this later in the chapter on sensation, but that when visual information enters your eye, it actually goes directly to the back of your brain first, to your retina, for processing. So just like the visual information goes to the back of the eye for processing, I like to think of it as going to the back of the brain for processing as well. So that's how I remember the occipital lobe is on the back of the brain. And then finally, we have the temporal lobes, which are at the sides of the brain, so just above each ear or behind the temples. And they are involved in hearing, language, object and facial recognition, memory, emotion, and perception. And of course, they contain the auditory cortex, as it's kind of implied, so it processes sound information. And I remember this one because I like to think temporal sounds like tempo. Tempo is something that you hear. Or you can also think of temples. It's kind of directly behind your temples. So again, that kind of connects the audition, the auditory sense to it. And then you can think of, well, it's right behind your ears. And it contains that auditory cortex, which is for processing of auditory information, so sound. And then it also contains an area known as Wernicke's area, which is in the left side again, and it is involved in language comprehension. So we have Broca's area, which is involved in language production, and that's in the frontal lobe, and I remember that one's there because I think, well, that's where the motor cortex is, so it makes sense that the one that's involved in producing speech would be located there. And then Wernicke's area, which is how we understand language, is in the temporal lobe, which makes sense because that's the lobe that processes our auditory information and our comprehension, so how we understand what's being said to us. And so that's basically your 4 lobes. So you should keep in mind the names of the lobes as well as the various cortexes associated with each, and just be kind of familiar with a few of the different functions of each, because I typically asked a question where you have to label the lobes and label the cortexes. Obviously that's kind of useless if I'm doing it for a short answer question, because you can just look at the diagrams in the textbook. So I won't be doing that this year, but it is important to kind of know about those lobes and the different cortexes and a little bit about the functions of each. So now we're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, and I kind of mentioned this one a little earlier, is the most forward part of the frontal lobe. So it is the front of the frontal lobe. It's much smaller in other species, and you might remember back to that diagram I showed you of the prefrontal cortex in humans compared to other animals, but it comprises 1/3 of the entire cortex in humans, so it is very large within humans. Which makes sense because it is the most recently evolved brain structure, and it is associated with the most complex abilities, so cognitive abilities such as reasoning, planning, and decision making. The frontal lobes also must have something to do with personality. So if you remember our case of Phineas Gage, the man who had the railway rod kind of rammed through his frontal lobe, and it really created some dramatic differences in terms of his personality. So that kind of implies to us that the frontal lobe must have something to do with personality functioning as well. And we've had other evidence that supports that sense. Many other cases support the conclusion that parts of the frontal lobe are involved in social judgment, rational decision making, and the ability to set goals and carry out plans. So we do see that damage to these areas causes what we would call a flattening out of emotion and feeling. So it kind of causes almost a numbing if they're damaged. So therefore we know those areas must be kind of important in those types of tasks. So as previously mentioned, the cerebrum is divided into 2 hemispheres. Each controls the opposite half of the body. Brain damage reveals what we would see as an apparent hemispheric specialization. For example, the left hemisphere is typically kind of implicated in language. Like we said, the Wernicke and Broca's area are both in the left hemisphere. And so left hemispheric damage may result in loss of speech or language comprehension. So with left hemispheric damage, we tend to see difficulties reading, identifying objects, making symbolic gestures, and describing events, whereas right hemispheric damage is more associated with difficulties identifying faces, interpreting emotional expressions, as well as understanding music and art, or a loss of location, so kind of our spatial awarenesses is kind of seems to be associated with our right hemisphere as well. So these are just a few examples of apparent hemispheric specializations that we see, so you should kind of keep these in mind. And I like to think left is language and logic, so the 3 L's, and then right is the other things, so like facial recognition, emotion, a lot of those types of things. So now we're going to talk a bit about split brains, which I mentioned way back at the beginning. It is a pretty complex procedure, and it's a little tricky to understand, but I find it so fascinating because it really kind of highlights some of that hemispheric specialization that we've been talking about. So in a normal brain, the 2 hemispheres communicate across that corpus callosum, so that band of fibers that connects the 2. And so whatever happens in one side is kind of immediately transferred to the other side. So in that way, no one side of your brain knows any more than the other side about what's going on around you. Myers and Sperry were 2 researchers who wanted to see what would happen if the 2 sides were cut off from one another. So they severed the corpus callosum in cats, which is kind of sad, but unfortunately a lot of our research has been done on animals, and it's led to some really important conclusions. So they severed the corpus callosum, and they also severed some of our optic nerves, so those visual nerves, because each eye normally transmits messages to both sides of the brain. So even though we said before there's kind of that crossover where, you know, one side of the body controls the other, so one side of the brain controls the other side of the body, and also with visual information it tends to come in one eye and go to the opposite side of the brain. There are some nerves that transmit messages to both sides with each eye. So what we found when they severed those nerves, so basically their right eye was only sending information to the left side of the brain, and the left eye was only sending information to the right side of the brain, is that if cats were trained to perform a task with one eye blindfolded, when the blindfold was switched, they behaved as if they had never learned the task. So because the 2 sides of the brain couldn't communicate with each other, it really caused kind of deficits in functioning if they were only able to see out one eye or the other. So it appeared in that way that one side of the brain did not know what the other was doing. However, it should be noted that ordinary behaviors in these animal studies remain normal. So if they weren't blindfolded, if they were able to see everything with both of their eyes, then it didn't really impact their functioning at all, which makes sense because if they can see everything with both eyes, well, that information is being sent to both sides of the brain anyway. So in the 1960s, surgeons decided to try cutting the corpus callosum in humans in an attempt to control debilitating epilepsy. So epilepsy is a condition known for having really kind of severe seizures at times. And seizures are essentially these patterns of electrical activity within the brain. So they figured if they're able to sever that corpus callosum, which kind of connects the two sides of the brain, then they would be able to maybe stop the spread of activity, which might lessen the severity of these seizures. So the split brain surgery was actually mostly successful in stopping the seizures, and it did not appear to affect patients in their daily lives, because as we said, the information, if it's gone into both visual fields, then it's going to go to both sides of the brain anyway. However, Sperry and his colleagues were later able to demonstrate that perception and memory had been affected, just as in the cat research that we discussed. So in order to understand the procedure, we must examine how nerves run from the eyes to the brain. So if someone is looking straight ahead, everything on the left side of the scene, so in the left visual field, goes to the right half of the brain, and everything in the right visual field goes to the left half of the brain, which is kind of what I was talking about a minute ago. And this is true for both eyes. So essentially what they did to assess the impact of the split brain procedure in humans was that they presented information to only one side of the patient's brain. So they devised this procedure in which they took two different photographs, they cut them in half, and they pasted half of each photograph together. So one half of the photograph showed something completely different than the other half. The photographs were presented on slides, and participants were asked to stare at a dot in the middle of the screen so that half of the image fell onto one side and half on the other. And the image was flashed so quickly that they had no time to move their eyes. Because of course, if they were able to move their eyes back and forth, then they're going to see both sides with both eyes. And that's going to kind of defeat the purpose, because it would, again, that information would go to both sides of the brain. But if it's flashed so quickly that they're only able to see, you know, say the left-hand side with their left eye and the right-hand side with the right eye, then that means that that information is only going to one section of their brain in this case. So when they were asked to say what they'd seen, they reported the person on the right-hand side of the image. So they said what they saw on the right-hand side, but if they were asked to point with their left hand, they chose the person from the left side of the image. So even though they couldn't explicitly tell you they had seen two different people, they were able to indicate that they had seen both sides of the photograph. And they reported nothing unusual having occurred. So they weren't actually able to understand, to kind of think about the fact that they were pointing at one image and saying the other. It was clear that one side of the brain wasn't aware of what the other had seen. So I can show you a picture here. It's a bit easier to illustrate. So if they are asked to look at this picture, we see that there's an older man on one side of the picture and there's a young boy on the other side of the picture. So because we have that visual crossover where whatever we see in the right eye goes to the left side, whatever we see in the left eye goes to the right side of the brain, if they're looking at this picture and the young boy is on the right and the older male is on the left, then the older male, that information is going to go to the right side of the brain, and the young boy is going to go to the left side of the brain. And as we mentioned a minute ago with that hemispheric specialization, the left side of the brain is the one responsible for language. So as I mentioned a minute ago, they tended to report what they saw on the right side of the photograph. This makes sense because if they're looking at that boy, and that image is entering the right visual field, it's going to go to the left side of the brain, and the left is the one that produces the language. So when asked what they saw, they're going to report having seen the young boy, because that's the part that went to the left side of the brain, which is responsible for language. However, because that older man, the information about what they saw with him went to the right side of the brain, the right side has no capacity for language production. So the right side isn't able to say that it saw, this older male. And so basically what happens is that they're not able to report having seen him. So if asked what they saw, they will only be able to tell you that they saw the young boy. However, if you ask them to point with their left hand, and this is where it gets kind of complicated, as we know, the left hand is controlled by the right side of the brain, because again, we have that switch over with the contralateralization. Then when they're asked to point with their left hand, they would point at the man. Because again, he was on the left side, which went to the right side of the brain, and the right side of the brain controls the left hand. So they would point at the older man, but they would say they saw the young boy, and they were unable to recognize that they had seen two different images. They weren't able to kind of explicitly state that, but they were able to indicate that they had kind of received both of that visual information. And so that's a diagram from the older textbook, but I really like how it kind of lays it out. It shows you the crossover there. And then we have another one from our current textbook here. So again, in this case, anything she's looking at that's on the left side of that picture, for example, the tree or the apple, if she was asked to point to what she saw, she would point to them because the right side of her brain saw those things, and using her left hand, that's what she would point to. But if she was asked to say what she saw, she would always say what's going to be in essentially the right visual field, because that's going to the left hemisphere of the brain, and that's the one that's able to produce language. So kind of a little bit of a conclusion, I guess, to this section is talking about whether the hemispheres are allies or opposites. So we said that they do have kind of their own specialization at times, but that doesn't really tell us whether, they're really working together or they're kind of completely opposite of each other. So there's definitely a limit to conclusions we can draw from split brain research. Obviously, we've only been able to do that type of research with people who had something severely kind of wrong happening in their brain anyway. So for example, that severe epilepsy, and those intense seizures might signify underlying brain differences from other people. So we can't really generalize those results, if you remember back to what we talked about in chapter 2. But research on right and left brain differences has also been done on people with intact corpus callosum. So even people who still have that communication between, we should still react slightly quicker to the information that's going to, the appropriate side. So you should be able to kind of name something slightly quicker if it was flashed to your right visual field, versus you would be able to kind of point at something quicker if it was flashed with your left hand, if it was flashed to your right visual field, or sorry, your left visual field. So our brains will quickly transfer the information across, but we're able to examine those differences, the slight differences in reaction time, that can indicate, again, some of that kind of specialization between the hemispheres. So early research often spoke of the left hemisphere as being dominant, but over the years, the importance of the right hemisphere has become clear as well. It's superior at recognizing expressions and handling spatial visual problems, and it's involved in the creation and appreciation of art and music, and it helps us recognize nonverbal sounds. So even though people might think, well, language, logic, reasoning, like a lot of that's on the left side, it doesn't mean it's any more important than the right side. So we like to talk of them as kind of working together rather than being opposites. So the right hemisphere has also been credited by some researchers as having an intuitive and holistic cognitive style, whereas the left is more rational and analytical. So in most activities, overall, we see the two sides cooperate naturally and each contribute valuable abilities. So most thoughts and behaviors require the two to work together, and their differences are more relative than absolute. So just because one is kind of more specialized for something than the other doesn't mean that both sides don't both contribute to most of the activities that we do. And then finally, to kind of close off this module, we're going to talk a little bit about the flexibility that our brain might have. So because of some of the common early experiences that most of us share, our brains are fundamentally similar in the way that they are organized. However, differing experiences due to personal traits and culture that we have while growing up can affect our brain's wiring and how it's used. So the human brain is not fully formed at birth. During infancy, so as a child is kind of progressing through their first year of life, new synapses are being created rapidly, which produces more complex connections in the brain. This increase in complexity can be fostered by new learning and stimulating environments. So exposing children to a bunch of different stimuli during this phase of their development can be really beneficial. So as a child grows, synaptic connections that are not useful are essentially just pruned away. So neuroplasticity refers to the capacity of the brain to change and rewire itself based on individual experience. It is most pronounced during early childhood and infancy. So our brain is mostly able to kind of change itself and kind of rewire things when we are younger, which explains why things like language learning tends to be a lot easier in young children than it is for older adults. So this plasticity may help explain how a person who suffers from stroke is able to learn to talk or walk again. The brain actually rewires itself to adapt to the damage. People who have been blind from early life actually show activation in the occipital lobe, which is, the one that contains the visual cortex, when completing a sound localization task. So it seems that maybe, if that visual cortex isn't going to be used for its intended purpose of processing visual information, sometimes it can actually kind of re-specialize itself to deal with auditory information instead, which also may help explain why some people say if they lose one sense, for example, their hearing or their vision, other senses tend to kind of increase in sensitivity. That might be because those brain areas are actually being kind of partially rewired to help out with the other senses instead. We've also seen that stroke patients who suffer from Broca's aphasia, so Broca's area being that area in the frontal lobe that's involved in language production, they can actually be aided in the recovery by something called melodic intonation therapy. So using this therapy where they're making the patients kind of sing these phrases and using kind of the auditory information as well to help out can actually help people recover better and be able to kind of return to a more normal functioning after something like a stroke that obviously really impacts the brain. So just kind of a bit of interesting information about how our brain isn't unchangeable, and that it can actually kind of grow and rewire over time, even in older adults. That is the end of Module 3. So that, like I said, was probably the most information-heavy module, but again, it's a lot of memorization. You're mostly kind of looking to keep in mind what the different brain areas do, like a little bit about each, as well as the different divisions of the nervous system, and kind of just understanding that split brain procedure, and a little bit about the fact that the brain is capable of change would really be kind of your take-home messages here. So thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next video, which shall be quite a bit shorter because it's only, I think, 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8 slides, just a little bit about brain mapping. So I will see you then.